Hi, MC Bling Daddy here. Welcome back to a series exploring the use of command blocks for coding as you might in a programming language such as C# or Java. And in this segment we are going to look at a different kind of loop, a for loop, in which we will use numbers for our loop control. And these numbers are not in geo-coordinates, as we have been testing for our minecart to extend a railway, but will actually be numbers that we will derive from a feature of Minecraft called a scoreboard. And let's take a look here and see what that will look like. And so we will be testing for a score from the scoreboard, and the variable that we will be using is one that tells us how many loop executions there are that remain. And we will be looking for at least one loop execution to remain before we then actually execute the extension of our railway by 1 at the location of our minecart. So let's go take a look and see what we have to do to get this going. I have set these commands in command blocks rather than executing or typing them in from the keyboard. You've seen my typing skills in an earlier segment. Not the greatest, but we will need to take a look at these commands to see how the scoreboard is being used. And what we need to do is we need to add in, they're called objectives. In a higher level programming language they would be called variables. And the most important one is the loop repeat, which basically tells us how many times do we have to repeat our loop before we're done. And I will go ahead and execute that command. And you can see that we've added a new objective, a new variable called loop repeat. The next thing that we have is a variable called loop index, and that will basically tell us where are we, how many times have we actually executed the loop. And we will add that in now. We've added the new objective, loop index. Let's see what's next. The next thing is that we need to calculate a variable called loop remain. Basically, it tells us how many remaining loops we expect to execute. And the reason for doing this is because basically Minecraft doesn't have a real good way, it does, but not a real good way of determining whether you have a specific value or you're beyond a certain value. But it does have a good way of determining whether a variable is 0 or greater than 0. So this will be a variable that we will have to calculate, and we'll see that in just a little bit, telling us how many times we have left to execute. And let's add that in. Okay, the next thing is we are going to actually set our loop repeat. We're going to repeat our loop 5 times. And this is the command. Let's review briefly. Scoreboard command. Players is the item that you have to have after scoreboard if you're going to actually set a player's value for a certain variable. If you remember, we set up in recent segments the ability to name our loop, our coding segment, if you will, consisting of a series of command blocks. And this name resides in a minecart that contains a command block. One of the nice things about the minecart command block is that it is an entity, and so it can be named, and it can be used for scoreboards. One of the disadvantages is it tends to move around a little bit. You have to be careful about bumping into it. And another advantage, though, is that the command block inside the minecart can actually execute commands. And then finally, the syntax of this command is that we have to specify what variable we want to use and what value we want to set it to. Of course, we have to have already defined or told our scoreboard that we want an objective called loop repeat before we can execute this command. But this command will then assign it to the entity that you've specified, even if it's not already there, and the value, of course, that you specify, and give it the value that you specify. So let's execute that. Okay, notice that the player has a very peculiar number. It's a, what is it, a GUID, as it's sometimes called. It's just a series of numbers, basically, that should be unique in the universe, although, you know, it's not guaranteed that'll happen. The probability is very low. All right, the next thing we're going to do is to set our loop index. And again, the index is how many times have we actually executed this loop? Well, we haven't done it at all yet. So our loop index is going to be set to 0. And let's set that now. Now, there's one other thing that we need, and that is we need some constants, some things that don't change. And so we are going to add a constant that we will call 1, as you'll see very simply. It is the value or the number 1, and after we add that in, we will go to the next command block, which then sets a dummy player called pound const. It will hold our constants as we need them. Doesn't really exist, but Minecraft lets us set up these dummy entities. And here is the variable we just defined, 1, and we are setting it to the value we expect, which is 1. All right, let's do that. Okay, now, in order to be able to track our loop, the next thing that we'd like to do is to be able to see what its value is. And so we will set up a sign, if you will, on the sidebar, which is the far right-hand side of the screen. And it will simply show us how many times we have remaining to execute our loop. Now, the loop variable is not set up yet, so it won't show up as having a value at this point. But when we start executing our loops, we'll see how many times we have that it remains to be executed. So let's see if we can set that up now. Okay, so we have set the display to show up in the sidebar, but since there's no value, it's not showing up yet. Okay, so let's take a look at our actual loop now that we have set up the variables that we need for this loop. And as I said, the number of remaining executions of our loop has to be calculated, and it's calculated based on what our repeat number was supposed to be. If you remember, the repeat number was 5. And basically, the syntax of this command is that we scoreboard player's operation. We define the player, or I should say the entity, which again is our minecart with the command block, and the variable that we want to compute. And in this case, we are setting it equal to, and we're using the same entity, except just a different variable. So this is what might simply be called an assignment statement, where we're assigning the value of loop repeat to loop remaining. This is one of the reasons why Minecraft is not particularly good at calculations is because it's kind of, it takes a lot of effort to do calculations. So first of all, we set loops, the number of loops remaining, to our loop repeat. And once we have done that in our loop, then we subtract the index. How many times have we actually executed our loop? And we will subtract that. If you remember, we just set loop remaining to be a loop, the number of times that we're going to execute the loop total, and so we subtract off how many times we've done it already, and we get the number of times that are remaining. And this is the variable you remember that we are setting up to look at in our scoreboard, our scoreboard display. Okay, finally, you remember last time we set up our loop to execute another method or subroutine or segment of command boxes, and that is still what we will do. And if we have determined that we have enough, if we still have loops to be executed, then we will execute our diagonal movement, adding adding dirt and air and so on in the XZ direction, which is diagonal. But before we do that, we have to do the calculation here because we haven't set it up to do it another way. But basically, we then add 1 to the number of times that we have actually executed the loop. It's a little early, it's just before we actually execute it, but again, this is about the only place we have to put it, because when we return back to the beginning of our loop, and so we don't really have any place to set that, except just at the end there. Okay, and again, we'll go back to take a look at our test. Our test for the loop is the name of our entity, and loop remain. This is the syntax that you use if you want to get the score, or I should say the value out of an objective, is score, and then the name of your variable, and then min is added on if you want to find out what the minimum value is of all the entities that you'll be looking at. And in this case, again, we want to make sure that we have at least one more execution to go. Okay, so that's pretty much what we're going to be doing. So let's take a look and see, first of all, watch in the upper right hand corner to see if our scoreboard appears. And here we go, executing our loop, and you can see loop remaining shot up. We are executing this loop, and we are also executing a loop over here. Well, we saw the last little bit of the last gasp of the last execution of our diagonal movement, but let's go take a look and see where our minecart is. Now, one thing that's a little confusing is you'll notice that the rail has not adjusted here. I'm going to actually remove the rail that's there, replace it with a new one, and you'll see that it pops into place as it should have at the very beginning, but for some reason or other didn't. Must be because we're executing code, and we'll take a look and see. Here's where we started. I forgot to show that to you, that we were starting over again, but assuming that we started on this rail, then there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces or 5 locations that the minecart has moved diagonally. Okay, well, that is a different kind of loop, a for loop. And next time what we'll do is we'll take a look into actually mixing and matching our our movements so that we can see how for loops might be integrated into your program as you're executing your command blocks. Well, that's about it for this time. Thanks for watching.